Hey there. Tonight, instead of wandering through quiet villages or lonely battlefields, we're slipping into the heavy crown and even heavier responsibilities of an ancient Greek king. Not the glorious kind sung about in heroic poems, but the real kind. The anxious ruler pacing in a drafty Megaron, worrying about omens, famine, curses, surprise godly visits, and the constant possibility that some wandering hero might ruin your entire week. You won't be living the life of a king exactly. Rather, you'll be settling into the quiet, uncomfortable realities behind the throne. The political nightmares, the divine interference, and the rather inconvenient habit the gods had of turning royal lives into cautionary tales. If this sort of slow, atmospheric storytelling helps you drift off, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it genuinely helps you rest. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always strangely comforting to see the little constellation of night owls scattered across the world. So dim the lights, find a comfortable position, let the day fade out behind you, and settle in as we slip quietly into the uneasy world of a king in Greek mythology. Section 1. The weight of the crown in Greek mythology. Kingship was less a privilege and more a punishment you couldn't politely decline. The image we tend to imagine, gleaming crowns, heroic speeches, loyal subjects cheering in the background, is a creation of later storytelling. The reality, at least in the mythological and Bronze Age Greek imagination, was far less comfortable. A king in those days was closer to a village problem solver, crisis magnet, and designated scapegoat. Someone had to govern, of course, but no one ever said the job had to be a pleasant one. In the ancient Greek world, kingship wasn't centralized or uniformly understood. During the Mycenaean period, around the 14th to 12th centuries before the Common Era, palace records refer to a ruler called the Wainax, a term that meant something like supreme lord or high king. This Wainax governed a palace economy that controlled agriculture, trade, and religious offerings. Linear B tablets, those clay records baked hard when palace fires consumed them, show us the administrative reality. The Wainax wasn't just a warrior sitting on a throne. He was a bureaucrat managing bronze allocations, tracking sheep, organizing sacrifices, and ensuring the proper offerings reached the proper gods at the proper times. After the Bronze Age collapse, somewhere around 1200 to 1100 before the Common Era, the title faded. It was replaced by the humbler basileus, a word meaning something between chieftain and local leader. But whether you were a mighty Wainax in a fortified palace or a village basileus with a slightly nicer chair than everyone else, the job carried a familiar theme. Everything was your fault. This, perhaps, is where Greek myth becomes especially revealing. Kings in myth weren't merely political figures. They were lightning rods for divine scrutiny. The gods, who were famously touchy, impatient, and fond of meddling, treated mortal rulers as their preferred targets. Whether it was Zeus disapproving of some ritual, Hera spotting a trace of arrogance, or Poseidon simply having a bad afternoon, the king was the one who received the divine memo, usually in the form of a monster, a storm, or a prophecy delivered by someone who refused to explain it properly. Take King Minos of Crete, for example. Minos asked Poseidon to send him a sign of divine favor so he could claim the throne legitimately. Poseidon obliged with a magnificent white bull rising from the sea, gleaming and powerful. All Minos had to do was sacrifice it back to the god. A simple exchange, really. Divine endorsement for proper reverence. But Minos, seeing how splendid the bull was, kept it. He offered a substitute instead, hoping Poseidon wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. Poseidon noticed. Poseidon cared. The god of the sea, who had an excellent memory for such things, punished Minos in spectacular fashion. He caused the queen, Pasiphae, to develop an unnatural desire for the bull. With the help of the craftsman Daedalus, she satisfied that desire. The result was the Minotaur, a creature half man, half bull, monstrous and insatiable. So Minos, instead of enjoying his newly divine-endorsed kingship, found himself constructing a labyrinth beneath his palace. He feted youths from Athens, 7 boys and 7 girls every 9 years, and dealt with the political consequences of having a monster for a stepson. A fairly standard workday for a Greek king. The underlying message was clear. Kings weren't independent rulers. They were caretakers of cosmic order. Whether they wanted to be or not, every decision was a test. Every ritual had to be done correctly. Every visiting stranger might be a god in disguise. And if a king offered poor hospitality, even by accident, it could bring famine, plague, or a curse that lasted generations. Hospitality, or xenia, as the Greeks called it, was deeply embedded in Greek society and carried particular weight for rulers. A king's palace was not a fortress of privacy. It was more of an ancient equivalent of a 24-hour guest house. Anyone could appear. Heroes, wanderers, prophets, the occasional disguised deity. And the king was expected to offer food, wine, and a warm bath. It sounds generous until you remember that many of these guests either caused massive trouble or revealed themselves to be the kind of divine presence that could smite you for serving stale bread. The story of King Admetus of Pherae is a good example. When Apollo was punished by Zeus and sent to serve a mortal, he chose Admetus. In mythic tradition, Admetus was the politest man alive. Humble, kind, respectful. The sort of person who bowed to beggars and never raised his voice. But polite kings attract unusual situations. Admetus not only hosted Apollo, treating the disguised god with perfect kindness, but became entangled in a series of divine bargains involving his own lifespan. Apollo, grateful for the hospitality, convinced the fates to allow Admetus to escape death if someone would die in his place. When the time came, only his wife Alcestis volunteered. She died for him, and Admetus, though he lived, was forced to reckon with the weight of her sacrifice. Being a king meant you didn't just entertain travelers. You negotiated with gods over your soul, because someone had to keep the palace running. The risks weren't only divine. Kings faced human challenges as well. Subjects expected their ruler to mediate disputes, maintain order, defend borders, and provide sacrifice to keep the gods content. When crops failed, when herds died, when storms hit, or when some hero accidentally offended a deity, the people looked to the king and said, "Well, fix it." If he couldn't, they assumed something was wrong with him. Perhaps he had angered a god, or performed a ritual incorrectly, or failed to interpret an omen properly. Leadership for a Greek king was less about issuing commands and more about performing a delicate spiritual balancing act while everyone watched closely. One can imagine the stress. Picture a king waking up one morning, preparing for a peaceful day, only for a priest to arrive at his door and say, "Your Majesty, the birds were flying in a troubling direction this morning," and that alone might be enough to trigger a citywide panic. Omens mattered. Dreams mattered. An offhand comment from an oracle mattered. The king's ability to interpret all of these correctly was treated as a barometer of his fitness to rule. And then there were the expectations of lineage. Kingship in myth was tied to ancestry, and ancestry in Greek storytelling was rarely peaceful. Many royal houses were famously cursed. The house of Atreus, the house of Thebes, the descendants of Tantalus, all were haunted by divine punishment long before individual kings were even born. Thus, many rulers began their reign already burdened by inherited disaster. Imagine taking office and being informed, "By the way, there is a family curse." It may manifest as betrayal, madness, famine, or visitation from a vengeful ghost. Good luck. Even kings without curses didn't have much time to relax. The ancient Greek world had no standardized bureaucracy. A palace had scribes and servants, yes, but the king personally oversaw diplomacy, conflict resolution, and religious observances. If a neighboring kingdom caused trouble, the king could not send a delegate or an email. He had to journey there in person, possibly on foot, and hope the other ruler wasn't in a terrible mood. Add to this the fact that kings were expected to be warriors. You couldn't simply sit on a throne and gesture toward the battlefield. A king fought in the front lines, sword in hand, which introduced the small but significant problem of dying before you had the chance to address last year's tax shortages. Agamemnon, who led the Greeks to Troy, was an example of a king overwhelmed by expectations and rivalries. His allies questioned him. His own family distrusted him. His decisions repeatedly offended the gods. And his triumphant return home ended in a situation that can only be described as unfortunate. He was murdered in his bath by his wife and her lover, struck down with an axe while trapped in a robe. Not exactly the heroic ending one hopes for after 10 years of war. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let's step back. Let's breathe. Let's settle into the understanding that kingship in Greek myth was not a celebration. It was a burden, and that burden was carried not by demigods or invincible heroes, but by men. Mortal, flawed, and deeply, deeply tired. Men who woke each morning wondering if today would be the day a prophecy came true, a god grew angry, or a cousin arrived with an army. Men who sat alone in drafty halls, staring at offerings they couldn't afford and omens they couldn't interpret. Men whose names would be remembered, yes, but mostly as warnings. Section 2. Divine interference and the impossible task of pleasing the gods. The gods of Olympus were not distant, abstract forces. They were present, active and disturbingly invested in the lives of mortals, especially kings. If you were a peasant tilling a field, you might go your entire life without direct divine attention. But if you wore a crown, sat on a throne, or made decisions that affected entire cities, the gods noticed. And once they noticed, they interfered. This wasn't benevolent guidance. It was meddling, often petty, frequently cruel, and almost always impossible to navigate safely. Zeus, king of the gods, was theoretically the protector of cosmic order. He enforced justice, upheld oaths, and safeguarded the rules of hospitality. But Zeus also had a temper, a wandering eye, and a tendency to take mortal slights personally. King Lycaon of Arcadia made the mistake of testing Zeus's omniscience. Zeus, disguised as a traveler, visited Lycaon's palace. Lycaon suspected the stranger might be divine but wanted proof. So he served Zeus a meal containing human flesh, the butchered remains of a hostage, or perhaps one of Lycaon's own sons, depending on which version you believe. Zeus was not amused. He overturned the table, struck Lycaon's 50 sons with lightning, and transformed Lycaon himself into a wolf. The punishment was both literal and symbolic. A man who acted like a beast would become one. The lesson was clear. Do not test the gods. Do not assume they are ignorant. And certainly do not serve them human flesh. But not all divine interference came from direct insult. Sometimes, the gods simply had preferences. They liked one city better than another. They favored one king over his rival. And if you were unlucky enough to be on the wrong side of divine politics, there was very little you could do. Poseidon, god of the sea, was especially dangerous. He controlled earthquakes, storms, and the waters that brought trade and life to coastal cities. He was also easily offended and rarely forgiving. When King Laomedon of Troy hired Poseidon and Apollo to build the city's walls, the gods expected payment. Laomedon refused. He claimed the walls were substandard, though they were famously impregnable, and sent the gods away empty-handed. Poseidon's revenge was patient and thorough. He sent a sea monster to ravage Troy's coastline, devouring livestock and threatening the city itself. The oracle declared that only the sacrifice of Laomedon's daughter, Hesione, would appease the beast. Laomedon, desperate, agreed. But at the last moment, the hero Heracles arrived and offered to kill the monster in exchange for Laomedon's famous horses, gifts from Zeus himself. Heracles succeeded. The monster was slain, and Laomedon, predictably, refused to pay. Heracles returned with an army, sacked Troy, killed Laomedon and most of his sons, and took Hesione as a prize. Only one son, Priam, survived, and Priam would later rule Troy during its most famous siege, the war that would destroy the city entirely. all because Laomedon wouldn't pay his debts. This pattern repeated endlessly. A king offended a god. The god punished the king, often indirectly, sometimes through plague or famine, sometimes through monsters or curses that outlived the king himself. Apollo, god of prophecy, music, and plague, was particularly adept at indirect punishment. When Agamemnon, leader of the Greek forces at Troy, refused to return the captive Chrysis to her father, a priest of Apollo, the god responded swiftly. For 9 days, Apollo shot plague-tipped arrows into the Greek camp. Men fell sick. Pyres burned constantly. The army, camped on foreign soil and already uneasy, began to panic. Only when the seer Calchas revealed the cause, and only when Agamemnon was forced to surrender Chrysis, did the plague cease. But Agamemnon, humiliated and angry, seized another prize to replace her. He took Briseis, the captive woman awarded to Achilles. This triggered the central conflict of the Iliad. Achilles withdrew from battle. The Greeks suffered catastrophic losses. Patroclus died. Hector died. And all of it traced back to Agamemnon's refusal to respect a priest of Apollo. A king's pride cost thousands of lives. Then there was Hera, queen of the gods. Hera was the goddess of marriage and family, which would be comforting if she weren't also vengeful, jealous, and deeply committed to punishing anyone connected to Zeus's many affairs. Kings, unfortunately, were often caught in the crossfire. If Zeus seduced a mortal woman, Hera punished her. If that woman bore a son, Hera punished him. And if that son became a hero or a king, Hera made his life a prolonged exercise in suffering. Heracles, though a hero rather than a king, exemplifies this. Born to Zeus and the mortal Alcmene, Heracles was hated by Hera from birth. She sent serpents to kill him in his cradle. When he grew strong, she drove him mad, causing him to murder his wife and children. His famous 12 labors were penance for that crime, labors designed by Hera to be impossible. He completed them all, but even in triumph, Heracles suffered. His second wife, Deianira, accidentally poisoned him with a cloak soaked in the blood of the centaur Nessus. The pain was so unbearable that Heracles built his own funeral pyre and died in flames. Hera's hatred followed him to the end. Kings born from Zeus's liaisons faced similar fates. Sarpedon, king of Lycia and son of Zeus, fought bravely at Troy but was killed by Patroclus. Zeus wept blood from the sky, but could not, or would not, save him. Even divine parentage offered no protection. Then there were gods who punished kings not out of anger, but out of offense. Artemis, goddess of the hunt and the moon, demanded absolute respect. When King Aeneas of Calydon offered first fruits to all the gods, but forgot Artemis, she sent the Caledonian boar, a monstrous creature that ravaged his lands. It took a gathering of Greece's greatest heroes to kill the beast, and even then, the hunt ended in tragedy. Aeneas' son Meleager killed his uncles in a dispute over the boar's hide, and his mother, grief-stricken, cursed him to death. One forgotten sacrifice destroyed an entire family. Dionysus, god of wine, madness, and revelry, was equally unforgiving. King Pentheus of Thebes refused to acknowledge Dionysus as a god. He banned the Bacchic rites, arrested the god himself in disguise, and mocked the ecstatic worship spreading through his city. Dionysus responded with calculated cruelty. He drove Pentheus mad, convincing him to dress as a woman and spy on the Maenads, the frenzied female worshippers of Dionysus. They caught him, and in their divine madness, they tore him apart. His own mother, Agave, leading the group, ripped his head from his body, believing she had killed a lion. When the madness lifted and she realized what she held, her scream, it is said, could be heard across all of Thebes. Kings learned, eventually, that the gods could not be controlled, predicted, or safely ignored. You could be pious, respectful, and generous. You could offer perfect sacrifices, observe every ritual, honor every festival, and still, through no fault of your own, a god might decide you were convenient for a lesson, a punishment, or simply a story. Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, played favorites with brutal efficiency. She protected Odysseus throughout his 10-year journey home from Troy, guiding him, disguising him, and ensuring his survival. But she also devastated the Greek fleet, scattering ships and drowning men, because one warrior, Ajax the Lesser, had violated her temple during Troy's sack. Ajax had dragged the Trojan princess Cassandra from Athena's altar and assaulted her. The goddess demanded justice. When the Greeks failed to execute Ajax, Athena's wrath extended to the entire army. The fleet was wrecked by storms. Ajax himself clung to a rock, surviving the shipwreck. In his arrogance, he shouted that not even the gods could kill him. Poseidon, at Athena's request, split the rock. Ajax drowned, and the Locrians, Ajax's people, were required to send 2 virgin girls to serve Athena's temple at Troy every year for 1,000 years as penance. One man's crime cursed an entire tribe. This, then, was the reality of kingship under divine scrutiny. Every decision mattered. Every ritual, every sacrifice, every word spoken in public or private could be judged, weighed, and punished by gods who rarely explained themselves and never apologized. You could not escape them. You could not outwit them. And if you tried, the punishment was often worse than submission. Kings learned to live in a state of constant negotiation. Offerings to Zeus for justice, sacrifices to Poseidon for safe seas, prayers to Apollo for health, gifts to Artemis to avoid her anger. But even perfect piety was no guarantee. Sometimes, the gods simply wanted drama. They wanted conflict, tragedy, and the slow unfolding of mortal suffering. And kings, visible and powerful, made excellent subjects for those stories. So the king would sit in his megaron, the great hall with its central hearth and painted walls, and he would listen to the priests. He would study the omens. He would pour wine for the gods and hope, quietly, desperately, that today would not be the day his luck ran out. And outside, the gods watched. They whispered among themselves. They made wagers, formed alliances, and occasionally, just occasionally, they smiled. Not in kindness, in anticipation. Section 3. Cursed bloodlines and the sins of fathers. If divine interference made kingship dangerous, hereditary curses made it unbearable. In Greek mythology, guilt was not individual. It was familial. The sins of a father stained his children, his grandchildren, and every descendant who came after. A curse, once spoken, did not fade with time. It festered. It waited. And it struck, often when the victim had done nothing to deserve it. 2 royal houses exemplify this horror more than any others. The house of Atreus and the house of Thebes. Let's begin with Atreus. Though to understand his curse, we must go back further. Back to his grandfather, Tantalus. Tantalus was a king of extraordinary privilege. He was the son of Zeus himself, born of divine blood and mortal ambition. He dined with the gods on Olympus, an honor granted to almost no one. He heard their conversations, tasted their ambrosia, and walked among them as a near equal. But Tantalus was not satisfied with privilege. He wanted proof of divine omniscience. He wanted to test whether the gods truly knew all, saw all, and could not be deceived. So he devised a plan. He invited the gods to a feast at his palace. He prepared the meal himself, carefully, deliberately. And when the gods arrived, he served them his own son, Pelops, butchered and cooked like livestock. The gods, of course, knew immediately. Most refused to eat, but Demeter, distracted by grief over her missing daughter Persephone, absent-mindedly ate part of Pelops' shoulder. Zeus's fury was absolute. He resurrected Pelops, replacing the missing shoulder with one carved from ivory. Then he condemned Tantalus to Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld, where he would suffer for eternity. Homer describes the punishment in the Odyssey. Tantalus stands in a pool of water that recedes whenever he bends to drink. Above him hang branches heavy with fruit, figs, pomegranates, apples. But whenever he reaches for them, the wind lifts them out of reach. He is eternally hungry, eternally thirsty, and eternally close to satisfaction without ever achieving it. This is where the English word tantalize comes from, to be tormented by something just out of reach. But Tantalus's punishment did not end with him. The crime he committed stained his bloodline. Pelops, resurrected and alive, carried the pollution forward. He would pass it to his sons, and they would pass it to theirs. Pelops grew into a capable, ambitious man. He sought to marry Hippodamia, daughter of King Oenomaus of Pisa. Oenomaus, however, had been warned by an oracle that his son-in-law would kill him, so he devised a test. Any suitor who wished to marry Hippodamia had to defeat Oenomaus in a chariot race. If the suitor lost, Oenomaus would kill him and nail his head to the palace wall. 13 heads already decorated the gates. Pelops, undeterred, sought an advantage. He bribed Myrtilus, Oenomaus' charioteer, promising him half the kingdom and one night with Hippodamia if he sabotaged the king's chariot. Myrtilus agreed. He replaced the bronze linchpins in Oenomaus' chariot wheels with wax. During the race, the wheels flew off. Oenomaus was thrown from the chariot, dragged by his own horses, and killed. Pelops won. He married Hippodamia. And then, to avoid paying his debt, he murdered Myrtilus. He threw him off a cliff into the sea. As Myrtilus fell, he screamed a curse. May the house of Pelops drown in its own blood. And so it would. Pelops had 2 sons, Atreus and Thyestes. They inherited not only their father's kingdom, but his capacity for betrayal. The brothers quarreled over the throne of Mycenae. The dispute centered on a golden lamb, a miraculous creature that had appeared in Atreus' flock. Possession of the lamb, it was said, signified divine right to rule. Atreus had the lamb, but Thyestes, cunning and ruthless, seduced Atreus' wife, Arab. She stole the golden lamb and gave it to Thyestes. Thyestes claimed the throne. Atreus, enraged and humiliated, eventually reclaimed power, but he did not forgive. He planned a revenge so monstrous it would echo through generations. Atreus invited Thyestes to a feast, a gesture of reconciliation. Thyestes, believing the feud was over, came with his children. Atreus slaughtered Thyestes' sons. He butchered them, cooked them, and served them to their father. Thyestes ate. Only after the meal did Atreus reveal the truth. He brought out the children's heads and hands, proving what Thyestes had consumed. Thyestes fled, broken and cursed. But before he left, he sought vengeance. He consulted an oracle, who told him that only a son born of incest with his own daughter would avenge him. Thyestes, driven mad by grief and rage, did as instructed. The child born from that union was Aegisthus. Years later, Aegisthus would murder Atreus' son, Agamemnon, fulfilling the curse. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and leader of the Greek forces at Troy, inherited all of this. The golden lamb, the throne, the curse. He was not a particularly wicked man. He was proud, yes, short-tempered, arrogant, but not uniquely evil. And yet, his life was defined by suffering inherited from crimes he never committed. When the Greek fleet gathered at Aulis to sail for Troy, the wind stopped. The ships sat motionless, trapped by divine will. The seer Calchas revealed the cause. Agamemnon had offended Artemis, goddess of the hunt. He had killed a deer sacred to her, and boasted that not even Artemis could have shot so well. The goddess demanded recompense. She wanted Agamemnon's eldest daughter, Iphigenia, sacrificed on her altar. Agamemnon, faced with the choice between his daughter and the entire war effort, chose the war. He lured Iphigenia to Aulis under the pretense that she would marry the hero Achilles. When she arrived, he had her throat cut on Artemis's altar. Some versions say Artemis substituted a deer at the last moment and carried Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess. Other versions say Iphigenia died. Either way, Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, never forgave him. For 10 years, while Agamemnon fought at Troy, Clytemnestra plotted. She took Aegisthus, Agamemnon's cousin and the son of Thyestes, as her lover. Together, they waited. When Agamemnon finally returned, victorious and proud, Clytemnestra welcomed him with feigned warmth. She spread purple tapestries before him, expensive and sacred, meant only for gods. Agamemnon, caught up in his triumph, walked across them. It was an act of hubris. Clytemnestra led him to the bath. As he washed, she threw a net, or a robe in some versions, over him, trapping his arms. Then Aegisthus struck him 3 times with an axe. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, leader of the Greeks, died unarmed, naked, and helpless. His concubine, Cassandra, the Trojan princess cursed by Apollo to speak true prophecies that no one would believe, was killed alongside him. She had foreseen her death. She had warned Agamemnon. No one listened. But the curse did not end there. Agamemnon's son, Orestes, was forced to avenge his father. Greek tradition demanded it. A son who failed to avenge his father's murder was not a man. But avenging his father meant killing his mother. Orestes, tormented and guided by Apollo, returned to Mycenae. He killed Aegisthus. Then, with the help of his sister Electra, he killed Clytemnestra. The moment her blood was spilled, the Furies appeared. The Furies, ancient goddesses of vengeance, punished those who shed family blood. They were older than the Olympians, more primal, and utterly merciless. They pursued Orestes across Greece, driving him mad, allowing him no rest. Only when Orestes stood trial before Athena herself, in the first murder trial in mythological history, was the curse finally broken. Athena cast the deciding vote in his favor, and the Furies were transformed into the Eumenides, the kindly ones, their wrath finally appeased. The house of Atreus, after generations of murder, cannibalism, and betrayal, was finally at peace. But the cost had been unspeakable. Now let us turn to the other cursed bloodline, the House of Thebes. This curse began not with cannibalism, but with a different violation, one of guest friendship of Xenia. Laius, king of Thebes, was exiled as a young man. He sought refuge with King Pelops, yes, the same Pelops with the ivory shoulder, who welcomed him with kindness. But Laius betrayed that kindness. He abducted and violated Pelops' son, Chrysippus. Some versions say Chrysippus killed himself in shame. Others say Laius murdered him to hide the crime. Either way, Pelops cursed Laius. If you ever have a son, he will kill you. The Delphic oracle confirmed the prophecy. Laius was warned repeatedly never to father children. But Laius, like so many kings, believed he could escape fate. He married Jocasta, and one night, drunk or careless, he fathered a son. When the child was born, Laius tried to undo the prophecy. He pierced the infant's ankles with a pin, binding them together, and ordered a shepherd to leave the child on Mount Cithaeron to die. The shepherd, moved by pity, gave the child to another shepherd, who brought him to King Polybus of Corinth. Polybus and his wife, childless, raised the boy as their own. They named him Oedipus. Swollen foot, Oedipus grew up believing Polybus was his father. But one day, drunk at a feast, a man mocked him, saying he was not truly Polybus' son. Disturbed, Oedipus consulted the Delphic oracle. The oracle did not answer his question. Instead, she gave him a prophecy. You will kill your father and marry your mother. Horrified, Oedipus fled Corinth. He vowed never to return, believing that by staying away from Polybus and his mother, he could prevent the prophecy. He traveled toward Thebes. At a crossroads, he met an old man traveling in the opposite direction. The road was narrow. Both refused to yield. Words were exchanged. Tempers flared. Oedipus, young and proud, struck the old man. The old man struck back. Oedipus, stronger, killed him and his attendants, leaving only one servant alive. The old man was Laius, his father. The first part of the prophecy was fulfilled. Oedipus continued to Thebes, unaware of what he had done. When he arrived, he found the city under siege by the Sphinx, a creature with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the face of a woman. The Sphinx posed a riddle to all travelers. Those who answered incorrectly were devoured. The riddle was this: what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Oedipus answered correctly. Man. He crawls as a baby, walks upright in adulthood, and uses a cane in old age. The Sphinx, defeated, threw herself from a cliff. Thebes, grateful, made Oedipus their king. As reward, he married the widowed queen, Jocasta, his mother. For years, they ruled together. They had 4 children: Eteocles, Polynices, Antigone, Ismene, and all the while, the truth remained hidden. But truth, in Greek myth, always surfaces. A plague struck Thebes. The oracle declared that the city was polluted, that a murderer lived within its walls. Oedipus, determined to save his people, vowed to find the killer. The investigation led, inevitably, to himself. The surviving servant from the crossroads identified him. Jocasta realized the truth first and begged Oedipus to stop searching. He refused. When the full horror was revealed, when Oedipus understood that he had killed his father and married his mother, that his children were also his siblings, Jocasta hanged herself. Oedipus took the golden pins from her robe and drove them into his own eyes, blinding himself. He had spent his life searching for truth. Now, he chose darkness. But even this was not the end. Oedipus's sons, Eteocles and Polynices, agreed to share the throne of Thebes, ruling in alternating years. But Eteocles refused to give up power after his year ended. Polynices, enraged, gathered an army and attacked Thebes. The battle is remembered as the War of the Seven against Thebes. At the final gate, the brothers met in single combat. They killed each other. Their uncle, Creon, became king. He declared that Eteocles would be buried with honor, but Polynices, the attacker, would be left unburied, exposed to the elements and scavengers. This was the worst fate a Greek could imagine. Without proper burial, the soul could not cross the river Styx. It would wander, restless, forever. Antigone, their sister, defied Creon's decree. She buried her brother, performing the necessary rites. Creon had her sealed alive in a tomb. When he finally relented, it was too late. Antigone had hanged herself. Creon's son, Haemon, who loved Antigone, killed himself beside her. Creon's wife, Eurydice, upon hearing the news, killed herself as well. Creon, who had tried to enforce order, was left with nothing but corpses. The curse had run its course. 2 families, 2 curses, countless dead. And the kings who inherited these curses, Agamemnon, Oedipus, Creon, had no choice in the matter. They were born into guilt. They carried it whether they knew it or not. And when the curse finally struck, it consumed not just them, but everyone they loved. This is the true horror of Greek kingship. You could be wise. You could be pious. You could try, with every breath, to do right. But if your grandfather made a mistake, if your great-uncle spoke a curse, if some distant ancestor offended the wrong god, you would suffer, not because you deserved it, but because the story demanded it. And the gods, watching from Olympus, would not intervene. They would only watch and remember, and occasionally weep. Section 4. The rituals, the sacrifices, and the burden of cosmic order. Being a king in ancient Greece was not merely a political position. It was a religious role. The king stood between the mortal world and the divine, responsible for maintaining the delicate balance that kept the gods satisfied and the cosmos in order. This was not symbolic. It was not optional. It was the foundation of his authority. And if he failed, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The palace economy of the Mycenaean world, the Bronze Age civilization that inspired much of Greek myth, revolved around religious obligations. We know this from the Linear B tablets, the oldest form of Greek writing, preserved when palace fires baked the clay records hard. These tablets, deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris, reveal a world obsessed with accounting. They list offerings to the gods with meticulous precision. Gold cups for Poseidon, amphors of olive oil for Zeus, textiles for Potnia, the mistress, a pre-Olympian goddess whose identity remains mysterious. The tablets from Pylos, a Mycenaean palace in southwestern Greece, document monthly sacrifices to a staggering number of deities. Not just the familiar Olympians, but older stranger gods whose names survive only in these records. One tablet, known as Pi Tien 316, lists offerings that include 2 men and 8 women. Scholars debate whether these were human sacrifices, ritual personnel, or some form of temple slavery. The ambiguity is unsettling. But whether or not human sacrifice occurred in Bronze Age Greece, the principle is clear. The gods demanded tribute, and the king was responsible for providing it. In myth, this burden is made explicit. A king who failed to honor the gods invited disaster, famine, plague, earthquakes, the death of livestock, the failure of crops. And if the disaster was severe enough, the people would conclude that the king himself was polluted, unfit to rule. In such cases, the solution was often grim. The king would be deposed, exiled, or killed. A new king, pure and acceptable to the gods, would take his place. The most famous example of ritual failure is Agamemnon's offense against Artemis. When the Greek fleet gathered at Aulis to sail for Troy, the winds died. The ships sat motionless, hundreds of vessels and thousands of men trapped by the will of a goddess. The seer Calchas revealed the cause. Agamemnon had killed a deer in a grove sacred to Artemis and boasted that not even Artemis herself could have made such a shot. The goddess, offended, demanded recompense. She wanted Iphigenia, Agamemnon's eldest daughter, sacrificed on her altar. Agamemnon was faced with an impossible choice. Refuse, and the entire expedition would fail. Tens of thousands of men would return home in shame. The alliance of Greek kingdoms would collapse, or agree, and murder his own child. He chose the expedition. Iphigenia was brought to Aulis under the pretense that she would marry Achilles. When she arrived, Agamemnon had her throat cut over Artemis's altar. In some versions, Artemis, moved by pity at the last moment, substituted a deer and carried Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess in distant towers. In other versions, Iphigenia died. Her blood soaked the altar, the winds returned, and the fleet sailed for Troy. Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, never forgave him. The sacrifice of Iphigenia was the wound that could not heal, the crime that justified, in her mind, everything that came after. But Agamemnon had no choice. A king's duty was to the gods, to the city, and to the expedition. Personal love, even for a daughter, came second. This is the burden of kingship. The gods did not care about your feelings. They cared about obedience. Sacrifices were not symbolic gestures. They were transactions. The gods provided favor, protection, and prosperity. In return, mortals offered blood, oil, wine, and grain. The process was highly structured. Animals were inspected for purity. The altar was prepared. Prayers were spoken. The animal's throat was cut. Its blood poured onto the altar or into a pit dug into the earth. The meat was divided. Some portions, the thigh bones wrapped in fat, were burned for the gods. The rest was cooked and eaten by the participants. A sacrifice was both a religious act and a communal feast. It reinforced social bonds, demonstrated piety, and reminded everyone present that the gods were watching. But not all sacrifices went as planned. King Aeneas of Calydon, a capable and respected ruler, offered first fruits to all the gods at harvest time. But in his haste or distraction, he forgot Artemis. The goddess, insulted, sent the Chaldean boar, a monstrous creature with tusks like spears and hide like iron. The boar ravaged Aeneas's lands, destroying crops, killing livestock, and terrorizing his people. Aeneas called for help. Heroes from across Greece answered. Meleager, Jason, Theseus, and many others gathered to hunt the beast. The hunt was successful. The boar was killed, but the aftermath was disastrous. Meleager, Aeneas's son, awarded the boar's hide to Atalanta, the female hunter who had drawn first blood. His uncles, Aeneas's brothers, protested. A woman should not receive such an honor. Meleager, enraged, killed his uncles. Aeneas's wife, Althea, torn between love for her son and duty to her brothers, remembered a prophecy. When Meleager was born, the fates appeared and declared that he would live only as long as a certain log remained unburned. Althea had snatched the log from the fire and kept it safe for years. Now, grieving and vengeful, she threw it into the flames. The log burned. Meleager collapsed and died. Althea, overcome with guilt, hanged herself. Aeneas lost his son, his wife, and his brothers. His kingdom, already weakened by the boar, descended into chaos. All because he forgot one goddess at one harvest. Then there was the law of Xenia, the sacred bond of guest friendship. Zeus Xenius, Zeus in his role as protector of guests and hosts, enforced this law with absolute severity. A king who violated Xenia invited divine wrath not just on himself, but on his entire city. The Trojan War, the greatest conflict in Greek myth, was fought because Paris, prince of Troy, violated Xenia. Menelaus, king of Sparta, welcomed Paris as a guest. He offered him food, wine, and shelter. According to the laws of Xenia, Paris was obligated to respect Menelaus' household, to honor his host, and to leave without causing harm. Instead, Paris seduced or abducted Menelaus' wife, Helen. This was not merely adultery. It was a violation of Zeus's law, an insult to the sacred bond between guest and host. The entire Greek world responded. Kings from across the Aegean, bound by oaths to Menelaus, gathered their fleets and armies. For 10 years, they besieged Troy. Thousands died. Cities were sacked. The Aegean ran red with blood. And the cause, beneath the romance and heroism, was a guest who betrayed his host. Zeus demanded punishment. And the Greeks, as instruments of divine will, provided it. Troy fell. Paris was killed. And the Trojan royal family, almost to the last member, was slaughtered or enslaved. Kings learned from stories like these that ritual obligations were not suggestions. They were requirements. The gods did not forgive. They did not forget. And if a king failed in his duties, the gods would find someone else. Someone younger, someone pure, someone willing to perform the rituals correctly, even if that someone was the king's own son. King Admetus of Phaera understood this better than most. When Apollo, punished by Zeus for killing the Cyclopes, was sentenced to serve a mortal for a year, he chose Admetus as his master. Admetus treated Apollo with perfect kindness. He did not know, at first, that his new shepherd was a god. He simply saw a stranger in need and offered him work, food, and respect. Apollo, grateful, blessed Admetus' herds. All of his cows bore twins. His flocks multiplied. Prosperity filled his household. But when Admetus' time to die came, Apollo intervened. He convinced the fates, the three sisters who spin, measure, and cut the thread of every life, to allow Admetus to escape death if someone would die in his place. Admetus, desperate, asked his elderly parents. They refused. He asked his friends. They refused. Only his wife, Alcestis, volunteered. She died, and Admetus lived. But the cost was unbearable. Admetus mourned not just the loss of his wife, but the guilt of his survival. He had been given a choice, and he had chosen himself. Later, the hero Heracles, visiting Admetus' palace and unaware of the tragedy, was entertained with Admetus' customary hospitality. When Heracles learned the truth, that Admetus was mourning his wife, but still honored the laws of Xenia by hosting a guest, he was moved. Heracles descended to the underworld, wrestled death itself, and brought Alcestis back to the world of the living. Admetus, through piety and hospitality, earned a second chance. But not every king was so fortunate. Most learned that the gods gave nothing without cost. Every blessing carried an obligation. Every favor required repayment. And if you failed to pay, the debt would be collected from your children, your grandchildren, or your kingdom's ruins. The palace, in this context, was not just a seat of political power. It was a temple. The Megaron, the great hall where the king received guests and made decisions, featured a central hearth that burned constantly, sacred to Hestia, goddess of the hearth. This fire was never allowed to go out. Its smoke rose through an opening in the roof, carrying prayers to the gods. Around this hearth, the king performed rituals. He poured libations of wine onto the floor. He burned offerings of meat and grain. He recited prayers taught to him by priests, words older than memory, passed down through generations. And he hoped, quietly, that the gods were listening, that his offerings were acceptable, that today, at least, no prophecy would come true, no curse would awaken, and no god would decide to make an example of him. Because in the end, being a king in ancient Greece was not about wielding power. It was about managing fear. Fear of the gods, fear of prophecy, fear of curses inherited from ancestors you never knew. Fear that, no matter how carefully you walked, how perfectly you performed the rituals, you were still mortal, still fallible, still, ultimately, at the mercy of forces far greater than yourself. And those forces, seated on Olympus, pouring wine and telling stories, rarely showed mercy. They preferred tragedy. It made for better myths. Section 5. Oracles, prophecies, and the trap of foreknowledge. The Greeks believed that fate was fixed. The future was not uncertain. It was written, known by the gods, and occasionally revealed to mortals through prophecy. This should have been comforting. If you knew what was coming, you could prepare. You could avoid disaster. You could change course. But Greek prophecy did not work that way. Instead, prophecy became a trap. Knowledge of the future did not prevent it. It ensured it. The more you tried to escape a prophecy, the more certainly you fulfilled it. This pattern, repeated endlessly in Greek myth, reveals something fundamental about the Greek understanding of fate. It was not cruel because it was imposed. It was cruel because it was inescapable. And kings, who had both the power and the responsibility to consult oracles, were especially vulnerable to this trap. The most famous oracle in the ancient world was Delphi. Located on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, Delphi was sacred to Apollo, god of prophecy. Pilgrims traveled from across the Greek world, and even from foreign lands, to consult the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo who delivered the god's pronouncements. The process was elaborate. Pilgrims paid a fee, sometimes substantial, to ask a question. They offered sacrifices. They waited, sometimes for days, for their turn. When they were finally admitted, they entered the inner sanctum of the temple. The Pythia sat on a tripod above a fissure in the earth. Some ancient sources claim that intoxicating vapors rose from the crack, inducing a trance state. Modern geologists have found evidence of ethylene gas emissions from geological fault lines beneath the temple, lending credibility to this claim. The Pythia, inhaling these vapors or perhaps entering a trance through other means, spoke Apollo's words. Her answers were famously cryptic. She did not speak in clear sentences. Her words came in fragments, riddles, ambiguities that required interpretation. Priests, standing nearby, translated her utterances into coherent prophecies. But even translated, the prophecies remained deliberately unclear. Consider King Croesus of Lydia. Croesus was a historical figure, ruling from 560 to 546 before the Common Era. He was immensely wealthy, so wealthy that his name became synonymous with riches. Rich as Croesus, the saying went. But Croesus faced a problem. Cyrus the Great of Persia was expanding his empire, and Lydia stood in his path. Croesus, uncertain whether to attack or submit, consulted the Delphic oracle. The Pythia's response was clear enough. If Croesus goes to war with Persia, he will destroy a great empire. Croesus, confident, interpreted this as a promise of victory. He attacked. The war went badly. Cyrus defeated Croesus's army, captured his capital, and took Croesus prisoner. The great empire destroyed was Croesus's own. When Croesus, awaiting execution, sent word to Delphi complaining that the oracle had deceived him, the priest replied that the oracle had spoken truly. Croesus had destroyed a great empire. He simply assumed it would be someone else's. This is the nature of Delphic prophecy. Technically true, functionally useless. But kings, desperate for guidance, continued to consult the oracle, and the oracle continued to speak in riddles. Sometimes, the riddle was designed not to inform, but to ensnare. King Acrisius of Argos learned from the oracle that his grandson would kill him. Acrisius, determined to avoid this fate, imprisoned his daughter Dano in a bronze tower. No man could reach her. She could bear no children. The prophecy would be thwarted. But Zeus, who was not deterred by locked doors, descended as a shower of golden rain and impregnated Dano. She gave birth to a son, Perseus. Acrisius, horrified, locked mother and child in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea. If the gods willed him to survive, so be it. But Acrisius would not kill them directly. The chest washed ashore on the island of Seriphos. Perseus grew up strong, brave, and destined for heroism. Years later, Perseus, having slain Medusa and rescued Andromeda, traveled to Larissa to compete in athletic games. Acrisius, who had fled Argos in fear of his grandson, happened to be in Larissa as well. During the discus competition, Perseus's throw veered off course. The discus struck an old man in the crowd, killing him instantly. The old man was Acrisius. The prophecy was fulfilled, not through deliberate action, but through accident. Not because Perseus sought his grandfather, but because both men, by chance, were in the same place at the same time. This is the horror of Greek prophecy. Fate does not require intention. It requires only presence. The most famous example, of course, is Oedipus. Oedipus's story is so well known that it has entered the language. Oedipus complex, coined by Sigmund Freud, refers to a child's unconscious desire for the opposite sex parent. But in the original myth, Oedipus did not desire his mother. He had no idea who she was. The tragedy lies not in desire, but in ignorance. Laius, king of Thebes, consulted the Delphic oracle and was told if he fathered a son, that son would kill him. Laius, believing he could prevent this, ordered his newborn son abandoned on Mount Cithaeron with his ankles pierced and bound. The child was rescued, raised in Corinth, and grew up believing King Polybus was his father. When Oedipus, as a young man, consulted the oracle, the Pythia did not answer his question about his parentage. Instead, she told him, "You will kill your father and marry your mother." Oedipus, horrified, fled Corinth. He vowed never to return, believing that by staying away from Polybus and his mother, he could avoid the prophecy. He traveled toward Thebes. At a narrow crossroads, he encountered an old man in a chariot. Both demanded the other yield. Neither did. An argument erupted. Blows were exchanged. Oedipus, younger and stronger, killed the old man and his attendants. The old man was Laius, his biological father. Oedipus continued to Thebes, unaware. When he arrived, he found the city terrorized by the Sphinx, a creature that devoured anyone who could not answer her riddle. The riddle was this: what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Oedipus answered, man. He crawls as a baby, walks upright as an adult, and uses a cane in old age. The Sphinx, defeated, threw herself from a cliff. Thebes, grateful, made Oedipus their king. As reward, they gave him the widowed queen Jocasta as his wife, his mother. They had 4 children together: Eteocles, Polynices, Antigone, and Ismene. For years, the truth remained hidden. But when a plague struck Thebes, the oracle declared that the city was polluted by the presence of a murderer. Oedipus, determined to save his people, investigated. The investigation led, inevitably, back to himself. A servant who had survived the attack at the crossroads identified him. Jocasta, realizing the truth, begged Oedipus to stop searching. He refused. When the full horror was revealed, Jocasta hanged herself. Oedipus took the golden brooch from her robe and drove them into his own eyes. He blinded himself, making external the blindness that had always been internal. Sophocles, the playwright who immortalized this story in Oedipus Rex, structured the play as a detective story. Oedipus, the solver of riddles, the man famous for his intelligence, slowly uncovers the truth about himself. The riddle of the Sphinx described the life of man, but it also described Oedipus's own life. The infant with bound, swollen feet, the adult king who walked upright, and the blinded exile who would walk with a staff. Oedipus solved the riddle, but never understood what it was telling him about himself. This is the genius of Sophocles. Oedipus is not stupid. He is not reckless. He is intelligent, decisive, and well-meaning. And yet, he destroys himself. Not through malice, but through action. Every decision he makes, every step he takes to avoid the prophecy, brings him closer to fulfilling it. Modern scholars call this a self-fulfilling prophecy. The term was coined by sociologist Robert K. Merton in 1948, but the concept is ancient. The Greeks understood that knowledge of the future could create the future. If you believe a prophecy, you act on that belief, and your actions make the prophecy come true. Laius abandoned Oedipus because of the prophecy. That abandonment ensured that Oedipus would not recognize his father when they met, and that lack of recognition led to Laius's death. Oedipus fled Corinth because of the prophecy. That flight led him to Thebes, where he fulfilled the prophecy by marrying Jocasta. The prophecy did not cause their actions, but it shaped them. It created the conditions under which fate would unfold. This is what makes Greek tragedy so powerful. The protagonists are not punished for being evil. They are punished for being human, for trying to control the uncontrollable, for believing that knowledge could save them. But knowledge, in Greek myth, rarely saves. It damns. Kings consulted oracles because they believed foreknowledge would give them power. They believed that if they knew the future, they could change it. But the oracles did not give them power. They gave them a script, a role to play. And whether the kings understood their lines or not, the play went on. Croesus fell, Acrisius died, Oedipus blinded himself, and the oracle at Delphi, sitting above her fissure, breathing vapors and speaking in riddles, continued to prophesy, because the gods did not share knowledge to help mortals. They shared it to watch them struggle. Section 6. The Trojan War and the Homecomings that Destroyed Kings. The Trojan War, the greatest conflict in Greek mythology, lasted 10 years. It began with a wedding, a golden apple, and a beauty contest between goddesses. It ended with a wooden horse, a burning city, and the destruction of an entire civilization. But for the Greek kings who fought at Troy, victory was not the end of suffering. It was the beginning. The war itself was brutal. Thousands died. Heroes fell. Achilles, the greatest warrior of his generation, was killed by an arrow to his heel. Ajax the Great went mad and killed himself. Patroclus, Hector, Priam, and countless others fell before the city finally burned. When Troy fell, the Greeks celebrated. They sacked the city, divided the plunder, and prepared to sail home. But the gods were watching, and the gods were angry. The Greeks, in their triumph, had committed sacrilege. Ajax the Lesser, son of Oileus, had dragged the Trojan princess Cassandra from the altar of Athena and violated her in the goddess's temple. Athena demanded justice. She asked the other Greek commanders to execute Ajax. They refused. Ajax was one of them. He had fought bravely, and besides, the war was over. The time for punishments had passed. Athena, furious, turned her wrath on the entire Greek fleet. She asked Poseidon, god of the sea, to scatter the ships. And Poseidon, who had his own grievances against the Greeks, agreed. When the Greek fleet set sail from Troy, storms descended. Waves rose like mountains. Ships were smashed against rocks, torn apart by wind, dragged beneath the surface. Men who had survived 10 years of war drowned within sight of home. This was the beginning of the Nostoi, the homecomings. And for most Greek kings, the homecoming was worse than the war. Let's begin with Agamemnon. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and commander of the Greek forces, returned home victorious. He brought with him treasure, slaves, and Cassandra, the Trojan princess cursed by Apollo to speak true prophecies that no one would believe. Cassandra, standing on the deck as Mycenae came into view, saw what awaited them. She saw the palace. She saw Clytemnestra. She saw the blood. She tried to warn Agamemnon. No one listened. When Agamemnon arrived, Clytemnestra greeted him with feigned warmth. She spread purple tapestries before him, expensive cloth meant only for gods. Agamemnon hesitated. He knew it was hubris to walk on such fabric. But Clytemnestra urged him, praising his victory, reminding him of his greatness. He walked across the tapestries. It was a small act, a moment of pride. But in Greek thought, hubris invited nemesis. And Clytemnestra's plan was already in motion. She led Agamemnon to the bath, a normal ritual after a long journey. As he bathed, she threw a net, or in some versions a robe, over him. His arms were trapped. He was defenseless. Aegisthus, Clytemnestra's lover, struck him with an axe. 3 blows. One for Iphigenia, one for the years of war, one for the concubine he brought home. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, leader of the Greeks, died naked, helpless, and betrayed. Cassandra, still cursed to see the future, walked willingly to her death. She knew no one would believe her. She knew she could not escape. The axe fell. She died beside Agamemnon, the last casualty of a war that had already ended. But vengeance, in Greek myth, is cyclical. Agamemnon's son Orestes was forced to avenge his father. Greek law demanded it. A son who did not avenge his father's murder was not a man. But avenging his father meant killing his mother. Orestes, torn between duty and horror, consulted the oracle at Delphi. Apollo told him to kill Clytemnestra. So he did. He returned to Mycenae, killed Aegisthus, and with the help of his sister Electra, killed his mother. The moment Clytemnestra's blood touched the ground, the Furies appeared. The Furies were ancient goddesses, older than the Olympians, spirits of vengeance who punished those who murdered family members. They appeared as women with snakes for hair, blood dripping from their eyes, voices like screaming metal. They pursued Orestes across Greece. They gave him no rest. He could not sleep. He could not eat. He saw them everywhere, circling, whispering, reminding him of what he had done. Only when Orestes stood trial in Athens, before the goddess Athena herself, was he freed. Athena established a court, the Areopagus, to judge him. The jury was split. Athena cast the deciding vote in Orestes' favor. The Furies, appeased, were transformed into the Eumenides, the kindly ones. Their wrath was finally satisfied. The curse of the house of Atreus ended, but it took generations. It took murder after murder, until finally, the gods intervened. Now, let's turn to another king, Menelaus, king of Sparta. Menelaus, whose wife Helen was taken by Paris, triggering the war, survived the conflict. He reclaimed Helen. He loaded his ships with treasure and prepared to sail home. But his journey took 8 years. Storms scattered his fleet. He was blown off course to Egypt, Cyprus, Phoenicia, and the distant coasts of Libya. He lost most of his ships and nearly all of his men. When he finally returned to Sparta, he was older, wearier, and profoundly changed. Helen, the woman for whom thousands had died, returned with him. Whether she went willingly to Troy or was abducted, whether she loved Paris or Menelaus, the sources do not agree, but she lived. And in some versions, she and Menelaus found peace. In others, the memory of the war stood between them like a wall. Then there was Diomedes, king of Argos. Diomedes was one of the greatest Greek warriors at Troy. He fought Hector and survived. He wounded Aphrodite and Ares in battle, an extraordinary feat for a mortal. But Aphrodite, goddess of love, did not forget. When Diomedes returned to Argos, he found his wife, Aegialeia, had taken multiple lovers. Aphrodite, in revenge for the wound Diomedes had given her, had driven Aegialeia to infidelity. Diomedes, betrayed and dishonored, fled Argos. He eventually settled in Italy, founding several cities, but he never returned to his homeland. Ajax the Lesser, the one who had violated Cassandra, met a fitting end. His ship was wrecked on the Capharean rocks during the storm sent by Athena. Ajax survived by clinging to a rock, and in his arrogance, he shouted, "Not even the gods can kill me." Poseidon, hearing this, split the rock with his trident. Ajax drowned, and the Locrians, his people, were required to send 2 virgin girls to serve Athena's temple at Troy every year for 1,000 years as penance. The tradition, known as the Locrian Maidens, was documented by ancient historians. It continued, according to some sources, until the 1st century of the Common Era. One man's crime cursed an entire people for generations. Then there was Idomeneus, king of Crete. Idomeneus survived the war. He loaded his ships and set sail for home. But during the voyage, a terrible storm arose. Idomeneus, desperate, made a vow to Poseidon. "If you spare me, I will sacrifice the first living thing I see when I reach shore." Poseidon accepted. The storm calmed. Idomeneus' ship reached Crete safely, and the first person to greet him, running down to the beach in joy, was his own son. Idomeneus, bound by his vow, sacrificed the boy. The gods sent plague. The Cretans, horrified and blaming their king for the pollution, exiled Idomeneus. He wandered the Mediterranean, eventually dying far from home. And then there was Odysseus. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, the cleverest of the Greeks, took 10 years to return home. His journey is documented in Homer's Odyssey, one of the greatest works of ancient literature. He encountered the Cyclops Polyphemus and blinded him, earning the wrath of Poseidon, the Cyclops' father. He visited the island of Aeolus, god of the winds, who gave him a bag containing all the unfavorable winds. Odysseus' men, believing the bag contained treasure, opened it. The winds escaped, blowing the fleet back to where it started. He landed on the island of the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibalistic giants who destroyed all but one of his ships. He reached the island of Circe, a sorceress who transformed his men into pigs. Odysseus, protected by the herb moly given to him by Hermes, resisted her magic. Circe, impressed, restored his men and hosted them for a year. He sailed past the sirens, whose songs lured sailors to their deaths. Odysseus, curious, had himself tied to the mast so he could hear their song without steering toward the rocks. He navigated between Scylla, a 6-headed monster, and Charybdis, a massive whirlpool. He lost 6 men to Scylla, 1 per head, but the ship survived. He landed on the island of Thrinacia, where the cattle of the sun god Helios grazed. Odysseus warned his men not to harm the cattle, but hunger eventually overcame them. They slaughtered and ate the sacred animals. Helios, enraged, demanded justice from Zeus. Zeus struck Odysseus' ship with lightning. The ship sank. Every man aboard drowned. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to debris. He washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, home of the nymph Calypso. Calypso, lonely and enchanted by Odysseus, kept him on her island for 7 years. She offered him immortality if he would stay. He refused. He wanted to go home. Finally, the gods intervened. Hermes, sent by Athena, ordered Calypso to release Odysseus. She did, and Odysseus built a raft and sailed toward Ithaca. But even then, Poseidon sent one final storm. The raft was destroyed. Odysseus swam to the island of the Phaeacians, where he was welcomed by King Alcinous. The Phaeacians, skilled sailors, gave Odysseus a ship and safe passage to Ithaca. When he finally reached home, he found his palace overrun by suitors. Over 100 men, nobles from Ithaca and the surrounding islands, had moved into his home, eating his food, drinking his wine, and courting his wife Penelope. They assumed Odysseus was dead. Odysseus, with the help of his son Telemachus and the goddess Athena, slaughtered them all. He strung his great bow, a weapon no other man could draw, and shot arrows through the suitors. Then, with Telemachus and a few loyal servants, he cut them down with swords. The floor of the great hall ran with blood. Odysseus reclaimed his throne, his wife, and his kingdom. He was the only Greek king whose homecoming could be called successful. But even Odysseus, the cleverest and most favored, took 10 years to return home. He lost every ship, every man, and a decade of his life. Victory at Troy brought no peace, no honor, no rest. It brought only more suffering. The gods had allowed the Greeks to win the war, but they ensured that winning came at a cost to hide a bear. Section 7. Succession, murder, and the violence within royal families in Greek mythology. The greatest threat to a king was not a foreign army or a divine curse. It was his own family. Succession, the transfer of power from one generation to the next, was rarely peaceful. Sons killed fathers. Brothers murdered brothers. Wives poisoned husbands. And through it all, the throne remained, stained with blood, coveted by all, and cursed by the very act of claiming it. The Greeks understood that power corrupts, but they also understood that the desire for power corrupts even faster. A king's children grew up in his shadow, watching, waiting, knowing that one day they would inherit his throne or be denied it. That knowledge bred resentment, ambition, and eventually, violence. The most famous example is the House of Atreus, which we have already discussed. But the pattern repeats across Greek myth. Take Oedipus's sons, Eteocles and Polynices. After Oedipus blinded himself and went into exile, his sons agreed to share the throne of Thebes. They would rule in alternating years, one taking the throne while the other stepped aside, then switching. It was in theory a fair solution. In practice, it lasted exactly 1 year. Eteocles, ruling first, refused to give up power when his year ended. He claimed the throne was his by right. He expelled Polynices from the city. Polynices, enraged and humiliated, fled to Argos. There, he married the daughter of King Adrastus and gathered an army. He returned to Thebes with 6 other champions, each leading a contingent of men. This war is known as the Seven against Thebes. It was a disaster. 6 of the 7 champions died. Only Adrastus survived. At the 7th gate of Thebes, Eteocles and Polynices met in single combat. They fought with swords, shields, and the accumulated hatred of brothers who had watched each other their entire lives, each believing the other had stolen what was rightfully his. They killed each other. Both died in the dust, their blood mingling, their curse finally complete. Their uncle, Creon, became king. He decreed that Eteocles would be buried with full honors, but Polynices, the attacker, would be left unburied. This was the worst fate imaginable for a Greek. Without burial, the soul could not cross the river Styx into the underworld. It would wander, restless and tormented, forever. Antigone, their sister, defied Creon's decree. She buried Polynices, performing the necessary rites. Creon had her sealed alive in a tomb. When Creon finally relented, urged by the blind prophet Tiresias, it was too late. Antigone had hanged herself. Creon's son Haemon, who loved Antigone, killed himself beside her. Creon's wife Eurydice, upon hearing the news, killed herself as well. Creon, who had tried to impose order, was left with nothing. No son, no wife, no family. The throne was his, but it was hollow. This is the fate of kings who prioritize power over family. The throne survives. The family does not. Now consider Peleus, king of Iolcus. Peleus seized the throne from his half-brother Aeson. He imprisoned Aeson and ruled in his place. But Aeson had a son, Jason, who had been hidden away and raised by the centaur Charon. When Jason returned to Iolcus to claim his birthright, Peleus, unwilling to give up power, devised a plan. He challenged Jason to retrieve the golden fleece from Calchas, a task widely believed to be impossible. If Jason succeeded, Peleus promised he would surrender the throne. Jason, with the help of Medea, a sorceress and princess of Calchas, retrieved the fleece. But Peleus, predictably, refused to honor his promise. Medea, enraged, tricked Peleus' daughters into killing him. She told them she could restore their father's youth by cutting him into pieces and boiling him in a cauldron of herbs. The daughters, desperate to help their aging father, did as Medea instructed. Peleus died screaming in a pot of boiling water, and Jason, though he had won the fleece and avenged his father, found that the throne brought him no peace. His marriage to Medea ended in catastrophe. She murdered their children to punish him for abandoning her. Jason died alone, years later, crushed by a falling beam from his old ship, the Argo. The throne of Iolcus passed to Peleus' son, Acastus, and the cycle continued. Then there was Aegeus, king of Athens. Aegeus had no sons, or so he believed. He had fathered Theseus in secret, leaving a sword and sandals under a rock as proof of paternity. When Theseus came of age and returned to Athens, Aegeus did not recognize him. Medea, who had fled to Athens after her crimes in Corinth and married Aegeus, recognized Theseus immediately. She saw him as a threat to her own son's claim to the throne. So she convinced Aegeus that Theseus was a dangerous foreigner, a usurper come to steal his throne. She prepared a cup of poisoned wine and gave it to Aegeus to offer to Theseus at a feast. Aegeus, trusting his wife, was about to hand the cup to Theseus when the young man drew his sword to cut his meat. Aegeus recognized the sword. It was the one he had left under the rock. He knocked the cup from Theseus's hand. The wine spilled onto the floor. A dog lapped it up and died instantly. Medea fled Athens. Theseus was acknowledged as Aegeus' heir, but even this happy reunion ended in tragedy. Years later, after Theseus had killed the Minotaur and returned from Crete, he forgot to change his ship's sails from black to white, a signal he had promised to send if he survived. Aegeus, watching from a cliff, saw the black sails. He believed his son was dead. He threw himself into the sea. The sea is still called the Aegean, after the king who drowned in it. Theseus became king of Athens, but his succession was marked by his father's suicide. Even in myth, where heroes triumph and monsters are slain, kingship demanded a price. And that price, more often than not, was paid in family blood. The pattern was so common that it became expected. Sons grew up knowing that their fathers might see them as threats. Fathers grew suspicious of their sons, watching for signs of ambition or rebellion. Kings who had seized power by violence lived in fear that their own children would do the same. And often, they were right. This cycle of violence within families is what the Greeks called miasma, pollution. Murder, especially within a family, was not just a crime. It was a spiritual contamination that spread from the killer to the household, the city, and sometimes the entire land. The only way to cleanse miasma was through purification rituals, exile, or, in the most severe cases, death. But miasma could also be inherited. A son born into a polluted household carried that pollution, whether he knew it or not. This is why the curses of the house of Atreus and the house of Thebes were so devastating. The pollution passed from generation to generation, like a genetic disease, infecting everyone it touched. And kings, as heads of their households and their cities, bore the greatest responsibility. If the king was polluted, the city was polluted. Crops failed. Plagues struck. The gods withheld their blessings. The only solution was to remove the king, through exile, abdication, or death. Oedipus, when he discovered his crimes, blinded himself and went into exile. His voluntary removal was meant to cleanse Thebes, but his sons Eteocles and Polynices inherited the pollution. Their mutual slaughter was both a consequence of the curse and a fulfillment of it. And Creon, who tried to impose order through harsh decrees, found that order imposed through tyranny only breeds more chaos. In the end, succession in Greek myth was not about who was most qualified to rule. It was about who was willing to survive, to outlast the curses, the prophecies, the plots, and the pollution. And even then, survival was no guarantee of peace, because the throne, once claimed, demanded everything: your family, your sanity, your soul. And when you finally died, whether by old age, murder, or divine wrath, the throne remained, waiting for the next king, the next victim. Section 8. Archaeological evidence and the reality of Mycenaean kingship. So far, we have explored kingship through myth, through the stories told by Homer and the tragedians. through the curses and prophecies that define these narratives. But what do we actually know about kings in Bronze Age Greece? What can archaeology tell us about the men who ruled before the myths were written? The answer, surprisingly, is quite a lot. The Mycenaean civilization, which flourished from roughly 1600 to 1100 before the Common Era, left behind palaces, tombs, weapons, and most importantly, written records. These records, inscribed on clay tablets in a script called Linear B, give us a window into the administrative reality of Bronze Age kingship. And that reality, while less dramatic than myth, was no less demanding. Linear B was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris, a British architect and amateur linguist. What he discovered shocked the scholarly world. The language encoded in Linear B was Greek, an early form of Greek, yes, written in a syllabic script borrowed from the earlier Minoan civilization, but recognizably the same language spoken by Homer and Sophocles centuries later. This meant that the Mycenaeans were the ancestors of the classical Greeks. The palaces excavated at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes were not foreign structures, but Greek ones. And the kings who ruled from these palaces, the Wainaks, were the historical models for the mythological kings of later tradition. The Linear B tablets do not tell stories. They are administrative records, lists of goods, inventories, ration allocations, religious offerings. But from these dry bureaucratic documents, we can reconstruct the role and responsibilities of the Wainaks. The Wainaks was the supreme ruler. Each palace center had only one. His title, Wanake in Linear B, became Anax in later Greek, meaning lord or king. Beneath him was the Lawajadas, the leader of the people, likely a military commander and second in command. Below them were various officials. The Kasiriyu, or Basileus, was not a king in the Bronze Age. He was a village headman, a local administrator, or possibly the chief of a guild of craftsmen. Only after the collapse of the palace system, when the Wainaks disappeared, did the Basileus rise to become a king. The palace economy was centralized and highly controlled. The Wainaks oversaw the production of textiles, the allocation of bronze to smiths, the distribution of grain, and the management of livestock. Tablets from Pylos, a palace in southwestern Greece, record thousands of sheep, hundreds of cattle, and detailed inventories of textile production. One tablet, known as the tripod tablet, lists dozens of bronze tripods and cauldrons, likely used for feasting or religious offerings. The palace was not just a residence or a fortress. It was the economic and administrative heart of the kingdom. And the Wainaks, at the center of this system, was responsible for keeping it running. But the Wainaks was not merely an administrator. He was also a religious figure. Tablets document offerings to a wide array of gods: Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Athena, Hermes, and even Dionysus, whose presence in Mycenaean religion was only confirmed by Linear B tablets in the 1950s. One particularly striking tablet, PyTN 316, lists offerings that include 2 men and 8 women. Scholars debate whether this refers to human sacrifices, ritual personnel, or slaves dedicated to temple service. The ambiguity is unsettling, but it confirms that the Wainaks had significant religious duties. He presided over sacrifices, ensured proper offerings reached the gods, and maintained the cosmic order on which the prosperity of his kingdom depended. Failure in these duties, myth suggests, could bring disaster. The Megaron, the Great Hall of Mycenaean Palace, reflected this dual role. It was both a throne room and a ritual space. The Megaron typically featured a large central hearth, 4 columns supporting the roof, and a throne positioned against one wall. The hearth was sacred to Hestia, goddess of the hearth, and its fire burned constantly. Smoke rose through an opening in the roof, carrying prayers and offerings to the gods. Around this hearth, the Wainaks hosted feasts, made judicial decisions, and performed rituals. The palace at Mycenae, the most famous of the Mycenaean sites, illustrates this well. Excavated by Heinrich Schliemann in 1876, The site revealed monumental walls, up to 8 meters thick in places, built with massive limestone blocks. Later Greeks, unable to imagine mortals moving such stones, attributed the construction to the Cyclopes. The palace sat atop the citadel, protected by these walls, and accessed through the famous Lion Gate, erected around 1250 before the Common Era. Inside the palace was the Megaron, with its central hearth and throne. Frescoes adorned the walls, depicting warriors, chariots, and religious processions. But the most striking discovery at Mycenae was Grave Circle A, a cluster of shaft graves from the 16th century BCE, roughly 400 years before the traditional date of the Trojan War. The graves contained extraordinary wealth. Gold masks, including the famous Mask of Agamemnon, which Schliemann incorrectly attributed to the mythical king. Gold cups, jewelry, weapons inlaid with precious metals, and bronze daggers with scenes of hunting and warfare. These burials demonstrate the immense wealth concentrated in Mycenaean royalty. They also demonstrate that Mycenaean kings, like their mythological counterparts, were warriors. Many graves contained weapons, and the frescoes depict kings riding chariots into battle. But this wealth was fragile. Around 1200 BCE, the Mycenaean world collapsed. Pylos burned around 1180 BCE. The tablets we have from Pylos were baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace, preserving them for over 3 millennia. Some of the tablets document frantic preparations for defense, assignments of bronze to smiths for weapon production, orders for coastal watchtowers, lists of military personnel. The Wainax at Pylos knew something was coming. He did not survive it. After Pylos, Tiryns, Mycenae, and Thebes fell in quick succession. The palaces burned. The linear B script vanished. The palace economy collapsed. For roughly 3 centuries, from 1100 to 800 BCE, Greece entered a period often called the Dark Ages. Population declined. Long-distance trade ceased. Writing disappeared. When Greece re-emerged into history, it was transformed. The Wainax was gone. In his place were the basileis, local chiefs ruling small communities. The causes of the collapse are still debated. Climate change? A severe drought struck the eastern Mediterranean around 1190 BCE, documented in tree-ring data and ancient texts. The Sea Peoples? Egyptian records describe invasions by mysterious seafaring raiders. Internal rebellion? Some palaces show signs of destruction from within. Earthquakes? The region is seismically active, and some sites show evidence of repeated quakes. Most likely, it was a combination of all these factors. A perfect storm that overwhelmed a fragile system. But the collapse of the palace system did not mean the end of Greek culture. The myth survived. Transmitted orally, from generation to generation, they preserved memories of the Bronze Age world. Homer, composing the Iliad and Odyssey around 750 to 700 BCE, centuries after the collapse, drew on these traditions. He remembered the palaces, the chariots, the bronze weapons, and the kings. But he also transformed them. He made them larger, more heroic, more tragic. The Wainax, a bureaucrat managing sheep and bronze, became Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, leader of 1,000 ships. The Megaron, a hall with a hearth and a throne, became a palace of gold and marble. And the administrative failures, the collapses, the fires, became divine curses, prophecies, and tragedies. This is the power of myth. It takes the fragments of history and transforms them into stories that reveal deeper truths. The Linear B tablets tell us that Mycenaean kings were administrators, priests, and warriors. The myths tell us they were also human, flawed, ambitious, fearful, and doomed. Both are true, and in the end, whether we look at the clay tablets or the epic poems, the message is the same. Kingship, in Bronze Age Greece and in myth, was a burden few could bear, and those who bore it, whether they died at Troy in their baths, or in the ruins of their burning palaces, paid for their power with everything they had. Section 9. From Homer to Tragedy, how kings became lessons, the stories of Greek kings did not remain static. They evolved, transformed by poets and playwrights across centuries, each generation reshaping them to reflect new anxieties, new questions, and new understandings of power and fate. Homer, composing in the 8th century before the Common Era, gave us kings as heroes. Flawed, yes, but fundamentally admirable. Agamemnon in the Iliad is proud and stubborn, but he is also decisive and commanding. Odysseus is cunning and occasionally cruel, but his cleverness saves him. These kings are larger than life, their deeds worthy of song. But by the 5th century BCE, in the golden age of Athenian drama, something had changed. The tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides took the same stories and asked different questions. Not what did the kings achieve, but what did their achievements cost? Not were they great, but were they good? The shift reflects Athens itself. By the time of the tragedians, Athens was a democracy. Kings were figures of the past, symbols of an older, discarded system. The tragedies performed at the festival of Dionysus were not just entertainment. They were civic education, moral inquiry, and political commentary. And kings in these plays became cautionary tales. Let's begin with Aeschylus. Aeschylus, who fought at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE, witnessed the Persian invasions and the rise of Athenian democracy. His trilogy, the Eurystheia, performed in 458 BCE, tells the story of Agamemnon's homecoming and its aftermath. The first play, Agamemnon, opens with a watchman on the roof of the palace at Mycenae. He's been waiting for a signal fire, news that Troy has fallen. When the fire finally appears, he rejoices. But his joy is tempered by dread. He knows what awaits Agamemnon. Clytemnestra, standing beside the altar, delivers one of the most chilling speeches in Greek literature. She describes how she will welcome her husband, how she will spread the purple tapestries, how she will lead him to his death. And she does. When Agamemnon's corpse is revealed, Clytemnestra stands over it, blood-spattered, unrepentant. She justifies the murder. Agamemnon killed their daughter. He brought a concubine home. He destroyed their family. The chorus, horrified, condemns her. But Clytemnestra does not flinch. She believes she has delivered justice. The second play, The Libation Bearers, follows Orestes. He returns to Mycenae, kills Aegisthus, and with the help of his sister Electra, kills Clytemnestra. The moment his mother's blood touches the ground, the Furies appear, ancient, terrifying, implacable. They pursue Orestes, driving him mad. The third play, The Eumenides, is set in Athens. Orestes seeks sanctuary at the temple of Athena. The Furies demand his blood. Apollo, who commanded Orestes to kill Clytemnestra, defends him. Athena establishes a court to judge the case. A jury of Athenian citizens hears arguments from both sides. The vote is split. Athena casts the deciding vote in Orestes' favor. The Furies, appeased by Athena's diplomacy, are transformed into the Eumenides, the kindly ones. They will no longer pursue vengeance, but will protect Athens. This is a profound transformation. Aeschylus takes the cycle of revenge, the endless bloodshed of the house of Atreus, and breaks it, not through violence, through law. The Oresteia is at its heart, a story about the transition from blood feuds to civic justice, from the rule of kings to the rule of law. Agamemnon, the king, represents the old system, power inherited, maintained through violence, subject to divine whim and personal vengeance. Orestes, judged by a jury and acquitted, represents the new system, accountable to the community, subject to rational debate, protected by institutions rather than gods alone. It is no coincidence that Aeschylus set the trial in Athens. He was celebrating his city's political innovation. Democracy, he suggests, is the antidote to tyranny and tragedy. Now, turn to Sophocles. Sophocles, born around 497 BCE, lived through Athens' golden age and its slow decline. His plays are more psychologically complex than Aeschylus's. His characters struggle not just with fate, but with self-knowledge. His most famous work, Oedipus Rex, is a masterpiece of dramatic irony. The audience knows the truth from the beginning. Oedipus does not. The play opens with Thebes suffering from plague. The oracle declares that the city is polluted by the presence of a murderer. Oedipus, determined to save his people, investigates. Every step he takes brings him closer to the truth. And the truth is unbearable. He killed his father. He married his mother. His children are his siblings. When the full horror is revealed, Jocasta hangs herself. Oedipus blinds himself. The play ends with Oedipus, once the greatest king, reduced to a blind beggar, led away by his daughters. Sophocles' message is subtle but devastating. Intelligence, decisiveness, and good intentions are not enough. A king, or any leader, can do everything right and still be destroyed by forces beyond his control. Oedipus is not wicked. He is not even particularly arrogant, at least not until the end. He is simply a man who believed he could escape fate. And that belief, that hubris, is his downfall. Sophocles later wrote Oedipus at Colonus, a sequel performed posthumously in 401 BCE. In this play, Oedipus, now old and blind, has wandered for years. He arrives at Colonus, a sacred grove near Athens, and seeks sanctuary. He is pursued by Creon, who wants to bring him back to Thebes. He is visited by his sons, Eteocles and Polynices, who both seek his blessing in their struggle for the throne. Oedipus curses them both. He predicts they will kill each other, and he is right. But at Colonus, something extraordinary happens. Oedipus, who suffered more than perhaps any figure in Greek myth, is transformed. He becomes sacred. His suffering, his pollution, is revealed to be divine. The gods summon him. Thunder rumbles. The earth opens. Oedipus walks into a grove, guided by divine light, and disappears. He is not taken to the underworld, but to something beyond, a place reserved for those whose suffering was so great it became holy. Sophocles, in his final play, suggests that there is meaning in suffering. Not justice, perhaps, but meaning. Oedipus does not deserve what happened to him, but by enduring it, by accepting it, he is transformed. This is a profoundly different message from Homer. In Homer, suffering is heroic if it leads to glory. In Sophocles, suffering is heroic simply because it is born. Now consider Euripides. Euripides, the youngest of the three tragedians, was also the most controversial. His plays are darker, more cynical, and more willing to challenge traditional values. His portrayal of kings is especially harsh. In the Bacchae, performed in 405 BCE, Euripides tells the story of King Pentheus of Thebes. Pentheus refuses to acknowledge Dionysus as a god. He bans the Bacchic rites, arrests Dionysus in disguise, and mocks the ecstatic worship spreading through his city. Dionysus, patient and smiling, drives Pentheus mad. He convinces the king to dress as a woman and spy on the Maenads, the female worshippers of Dionysus. The Maenads, in their divine frenzy, catch Pentheus. They tear him apart with their bare hands. His mother, Agave, leads the group. In her madness, she believes she has killed a lion. She carries Pentheus's head back to Thebes, singing in triumph. When the madness lifts, when she realizes what she holds, her scream echoes across the city. Euripides' message is brutal. A king who denies the gods, who refuses to acknowledge forces beyond reason and control, will be destroyed. But there's more. Pentheus is not simply a skeptic. He is repressed, rigid, frightened of the chaos that Dionysus represents. The Bacchae is a play about the danger of denying parts of ourselves. The irrational, the ecstatic, the uncontrolled. Pentheus, by trying to impose absolute order, destroys himself and his family. Euripides also wrote Hecuba and the Trojan Women, plays that depict the aftermath of the Trojan War from the perspective of the defeated. In the Trojan Women, performed in 415 BCE during the Peloponnesian War, Euripides shows the suffering of Hecuba, Andromache, and Cassandra as they are divided among the Greek victors as slaves. There are no kings in this play, except as distant, unseen figures who have caused all this suffering. The play is a lament, a cry of grief for the innocent victims of war, for the women and children who had no say in the conflict, but bore its consequences. It was performed just after Athens had destroyed the island of Melos, killing all the men and enslaving the women and children, simply because Melos refused to join their alliance. Euripides' audience, sitting in the theater, would have understood the parallel. War, the play suggests, does not ennoble. It destroys. And those who wage it, the kings and generals, are not heroes. They are architects of misery. This is a far cry from Homer's glorification of Agamemnon and Achilles. By the end of the 5th century BCE, the figure of the king in Greek literature had been thoroughly deconstructed. Kings were no longer models of heroism. They were warnings. Warnings about the dangers of pride, the limits of power, the inevitability of fate, and the costs of ambition. The tragedians took the stories passed down from the Bronze Age, stories of palace intrigue and divine curses, and made them timeless. Because the questions they asked about justice, suffering, knowledge, and power are questions every generation must answer. And the kings, trapped in their myths, became the vehicles for those questions, not because they had answers, but because their failures illuminated the questions so clearly. Section 10. The philosophical weight of the crown Greek philosophy, emerging in the centuries after Homer and developing alongside the tragedians, approached kingship from a different angle. Philosophers asked not, what happened to these kings, but what should a king be? And in answering that question, they revealed just how impossible true kingship was. Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, was obsessed with the question of the ideal ruler. His most famous work, The Republic, constructs an imaginary city governed by philosopher kings. These rulers would be educated in mathematics, music, dialectic, and philosophy. They would have no private property, no families, no personal ambitions. They would rule not for power or wealth, but because they alone understood the good. It's a beautiful vision. It's also profoundly inhuman. Plato recognized this. The philosopher king is not a real person. He is an ideal, a standard against which actual rulers inevitably fall short. Real kings, Plato suggests, are shadows. They rule based on opinion, tradition, and force. They lack the wisdom to govern justly. And because they lack wisdom, their rule is inherently flawed. Plato's student, Aristotle, was more pragmatic. In his Politics, Aristotle argues that kingship, ruled by one man, can be legitimate if that man is virtuous and wise. But such men are rare. More often, kingship degenerates into tyranny, ruled by one man for his own benefit. Aristotle distinguishes between different forms of government. Monarchy, aristocracy, and polity are the good forms, where rulers govern for the common good. Tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy are the corrupt forms, where rulers govern for their own interests. But even good kingship, Aristotle admits, is fragile. It depends entirely on the virtue of the king. And virtue, as the myths demonstrate, is difficult to maintain. Power corrupts. Not always, not inevitably, but often enough that relying on a single virtuous ruler is a gamble. Aristotle's solution was mixed government, combining elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy to balance power and prevent any one group from dominating. This idea, though not fully realized in ancient Greece, would influence political thought for centuries. The Stoics, a philosophical school founded by Zeno of Citium in the early 3rd century BCE, offered yet another perspective. The Stoics taught that the wise man, the sage, is the only true king, not because he wears a crown or commands armies, but because he rules himself. The Stoic sage is free from passion, immune to fear, unswayed by fortune. He accepts fate with equanimity. He acts virtuously regardless of consequences. This internal kingship, mastery of oneself, was contrasted with the external kingship of political rulers. A king might rule a city or an empire, but if he is ruled by anger, fear, or desire, he is not truly a king. He is a slave to his passions. This philosophy had profound implications for how Greeks thought about the mythological kings. Agamemnon, governed by pride and ambition, was not a true king. He was a slave to his ego. Oedipus, driven by the need to know, was not free. He was bound by curiosity and fear. Only the sage, who accepted fate without struggling, who acted virtuously without expectation of reward, could truly be called a king. But such sages, like Plato's philosopher kings, were rare. Perhaps they didn't exist at all. The Cynics, another philosophical school, took this critique even further. Diogenes of Sinope, the most famous cynic, lived in a barrel and owned almost nothing. He mocked the wealthy, the powerful, and the pretentious. When Alexander the Great, who fancied himself a philosopher as well as a conqueror, visited Diogenes and asked if there was anything he desired, Diogenes replied, "Yes, step out of my sunlight." Alexander, impressed, reportedly said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." To which Diogenes is said to have replied, "If I were not Diogenes, I would also wish to be Diogenes." The Cynics rejected the value of kingship entirely. Power, wealth, and status were distractions from virtue. True freedom, they argued, came from needing nothing. A king, surrounded by luxury and responsibility, was the least free person imaginable. This philosophical critique of kingship deepened the portrait sketched by myth and tragedy. Kings were not just cursed by the gods. They were trapped by their own nature, trapped by ambition, by duty, by the expectations of their subjects, and by their own inability to rule themselves. Even the most virtuous king, trying his best to act justly, was limited by his mortality, his ignorance, and the complexities of governing. And the worst kings, those who ruled through tyranny and cruelty, reveal what power did to those who lacked virtue. The Greek experience with kingship, both mythological and historical, was largely negative. They remembered the Bronze Age kings as figures of immense power and tragic flaws. They lived under kings in the Dark Ages, and those kings were often petty tyrants. By the Classical period, most Greek city-states had abolished kingship entirely, replacing it with oligarchies, democracies, or mixed constitutions. Sparta retained kings, but they were constrained by a council of elders and a dual kingship that divided power. Athens experimented with tyranny briefly under Pisistratos and his sons, but expelled them in 510 BCE and established democracy. The Greek distrust of monarchy influenced Western political thought for millennia. The Romans, though they eventually accepted emperors, always maintained the fiction that they were a republic. Medieval European kings claimed divine right, but they were constantly challenged by nobles, councils, and emerging parliaments. And the modern democratic revolutions, from the American to the French, were fought explicitly against kings. The Greek insight preserved in myth, tragedy, and philosophy was this: power concentrated in one person is dangerous. Not because that person is necessarily evil, but because they are human. And humans, even the best of them, are fallible. Kings make mistakes. They are swayed by emotion, blinded by pride, misled by advisors, and overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. And when a king makes a mistake, everyone suffers. The solution, Greeks increasingly believed, was not better kings. It was no kings at all, or at least institutions that constrained, balanced, and checked the power of rulers. This is the lasting legacy of Greek thought on kingship. Not the glorification of heroes, but the recognition of human limitation. Not faith in great men, but wariness of concentrated power, and a deep, abiding skepticism toward anyone who claimed the right to rule alone. Section 11. The Eternal Burden. Why kingship could never be escaped. There's a peculiar feature of Greek kingship that appears again and again in myth. You cannot abdicate. Once you become king, you are king until you die, or until you're murdered, or until a prophecy is fulfilled and the curse consumes you. But you cannot simply walk away. Oedipus tried. After discovering his crimes, He blinded himself and left Thebes. He wandered for years, dependent on his daughters, hated by his sons, scorned by cities that refused him shelter. But even in exile, he was still king. The pollution followed him. His suffering continued. Only at Colonus, at the very end, did the gods release him. And even then, it was not an escape. It was a transformation. Kings in Greek myth are bound to their thrones, not by choice, but by fate. The throne chooses the king as much as the king claims the throne. This is most clearly illustrated in the story of Theseus. Theseus, after slaying the Minotaur and returning to Athens, was hailed as a hero. His father Aegeus had died, and Theseus became king. But Theseus was restless. He continued adventuring. He traveled to the underworld with his friend Pirithous to kidnap Persephone, queen of the dead. It did not go well. Hades trapped them on chairs of forgetfulness. They sat, unable to move, for years. Eventually, Heracles passed through the underworld and freed Theseus. Pirithous, who had been more directly responsible for the plan, was left behind. When Theseus finally returned to Athens, he found his kingdom in chaos. A usurper, Menestheus, had seized power. The people, angry at Theseus' long absence, supported him. Theseus, the great hero, was exiled from his own city. He fled to the island of Skyros, where King Lycomedes, ostensibly a friend, pushed him off a cliff to his death. Theseus' story illustrates a fundamental truth. A king who abandons his duties, even for heroic reasons, loses his throne. The throne does not wait. The kingdom does not pause. And when the king returns, he may find that he is no longer wanted. This is the burden of kingship. It demands everything: constant presence, constant vigilance, constant sacrifice. You cannot be a king and also be free. The two are incompatible. Even kings who ruled wisely and well found that the crown weighed heavier with time. Nestor, king of Pylos, appears in Homer's Iliad as the elder statesman of the Greek alliance. He is wise, cautious, and respected, but he's also old, achingly old. He fought in wars 2 generations before Troy. He remembers heroes long dead. He speaks at length, often rambling, trying to pass on wisdom to younger men who listen politely and then ignore him. Nestor's burden is not curses or prophecies. It is obsolescence. He has lived too long. The world he knew is gone. His advice, rooted in past victories, no longer applies, and yet he cannot stop being king. He sails to Troy because his honor demands it. He fights, though his body is frail. He counsels, though no one listens, because a king's duty does not end until the king does. Then there's Peleus, father of Achilles. Peleus was a hero in his youth. He sailed with the Argonauts. He married the sea goddess Thetis, a union that produced Achilles, the greatest warrior of his generation. But Peleus outlived his son. Achilles died at Troy. Peleus, alone in his palace, waited for news that never came. He grew old, frail, and powerless. His grandson, Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, inherited the heroism but not the wisdom. Neoptolemus was brutal, arrogant, and violent. He was eventually killed at Delphi, murdered in Apollo's temple. Peleus, having lost his son and grandson, died alone. His story is a reminder that even the most blessed kingship ends in loss. The Greeks understood this. They built it into their myths. Kingship was not a reward. It was a trial, a test that most men failed. And those who passed, who ruled wisely and well, were still mortal. They still aged. They still died. And after they died, their kingdoms passed to the next generation, who might squander everything, who might trigger new curses, who might be even worse. This is why the Greek distrust of monarchy ran so deep. It was not just that kings could be tyrants. It was that even good kings could not guarantee good successors. The throne, indifferent to virtue or wisdom, passed to whoever claimed it. Sometimes the eldest son, sometimes the strongest, sometimes the cleverest, but never, in Greek myth, to the worthiest, because worth, in the Greek understanding, was not inherited. It was earned. And the throne, once claimed, had to be defended against rivals, against curses, against the gods, and against the slow erosion of time. No king in Greek myth ruled peacefully from youth to old age, passing the throne to a grateful son who ruled just as well. It simply did not happen, because Greek myth was not fantasy. It was realism dressed in divine language. The realism of power, the realism of human failure, the realism of a world that did not reward virtue with happiness. The Greeks did not write myths to comfort themselves. They wrote myths to prepare themselves for disappointment, for suffering, for the knowledge that even if you did everything right, you could still lose. This is the eternal burden of kingship. Not the crown itself, but what it represents. Responsibility without escape, power without peace, legacy without control. And every king, whether he ruled Thebes or Mycenae, Athens or Ithaca, carried that burden until it crushed him, or until the gods, in their occasional mercy, released him into death. Section 12. Conclusion. The crown is eternal warning, and so we come to the end. Not of the myths, those will outlive us all, but of this particular journey through the weight, the terror, and the inescapable tragedy of being a king in Greek mythology. We've walked through cursed bloodlines, where the sins of grandfathers drowned their grandchildren. We've watched kings receive prophecies designed not to save them, but to trap them. We've seen divine interference turn victories into disasters, and ambition curdle into madness. We've stood in the Megaron, the great hall where smoke rises through the roof and the king sits alone by the hearth, wondering if today will be the day the curse comes due. We've traced the Nostoi, the homecomings that destroyed more kings than the war itself. We've witnessed succession struggles that turn brothers into corpses and fathers into exiles. We've looked at the archaeological evidence, the clay tablets and burned palaces that tell us the Mycenaean Wainax was not a god king but an exhausted administrator trying to keep a fragile system from collapsing. We've seen how poets and playwrights across centuries reshaped these stories. How Homer's heroes became Sophocles' tragic figures. How Aeschylus turned revenge into justice. How Euripides turned glory into grief. And through it all, one truth remained constant. Being a king in Greek mythology was not a blessing. It was a burden you could not refuse, a fate you could not escape, and a story that ended, almost always, in blood. The crown was heavy not because it was made of gold, but because it was made of expectation, obligation, and inherited guilt. You wore it not because you wanted to, but because someone decided you would. The gods, perhaps, or prophecy, or simply the accident of birth. And once it was on your head, it could not be removed, not without losing your head along with it. The Greek myths, for all their gods and monsters, are deeply, achingly human. They are stories about people trying to do the right thing and failing, about people trying to escape fate and running straight into it, about people who believed that power would protect them, only to discover that power made them targets. Kings, in these stories, are not villains. They are warnings. They warn us about the dangers of hubris, about believing that we are above the rules, above fate, above the gods. They warn us about the limits of knowledge. Oedipus knew everything except the one thing that mattered. They warn us about the cost of ambition. Agamemnon won the war and lost everything else. They warn us about the fragility of justice. Creon tried to enforce order and created chaos. And they warn us most profoundly about the loneliness of power. Every king in Greek mythology, whether surrounded by armies or advisors or loyal subjects, was fundamentally alone. Alone in the Megaron, with the fire burning low and the shadows growing long. Alone with the knowledge that the decisions he made would ripple outward, affecting thousands, and that he could not unmake those decisions, no matter how much he might wish to. Alone with the understanding that he was mortal, fallible, and ultimately powerless against the forces that shaped his fate. This is why these stories endure, not because they are comforting, but because they are true. Not factually true, not historically accurate in the way a textbook is accurate, but true in the way that art is true. True to the human experience of power, responsibility, fear, and failure. The Greeks understood something that we, in our more optimistic age, sometimes forget. That power does not ennoble, it reveals. It reveals who you are beneath the crown. And more often than not, what it reveals is not flattering. The best kings, the ones we admire, are not the ones who succeeded. They are the ones who tried, who bore their burdens with as much grace as they could manage, who made hard choices, knowing they would be judged for them. Odysseus, clever and resourceful, still took 10 years to get home and lost every man under his command. Theseus, brave and heroic, still ended his life pushed off a cliff by a false friend. Even Nestor, wise and cautious, watched his world fade into irrelevance. There are no happy kings in Greek mythology, only degrees of tragedy. And yet, the myths were told, again and again, generation after generation, around fires and in theaters, in palaces and in poems. Because these stories mattered. They reminded the Greeks who they were, where they came from, and what happened when mortals forgot their place. They reminded kings that they were not gods, that they would die, that their choices had consequences. And they reminded everyone else that kings, for all their power, were just as trapped as anyone, trapped by fate, by prophecy, by the expectations of their ancestors and the demands of their gods. And perhaps, in that recognition, there was a kind of comfort, not joy, but understanding. The understanding that suffering is universal, that even the powerful are powerless, that even the wise are blind, and that in the end, we are all just mortals, stumbling through a world we don't fully understand, trying to do right by the people we love, and hoping, quietly, that the gods are not paying too much attention. Because when the gods pay attention, when they descend from Olympus and meddle in mortal affairs, when they deliver prophecies and demand sacrifices and curse bloodlines for generations, nothing good ever comes of it. The crown, in Greek mythology, is not a symbol of power. It is a symbol of vulnerability. It marks you. It makes you visible. It draws the gaze of forces far greater than yourself. And once that gaze falls on you, you cannot hide. You can only endure. So let's leave the kings where we found them, in their megara, beside their hearths, staring into the flames and wondering what tomorrow will bring. Let's leave them to their prophecies and their curses, their ambitions and their regrets. Let's leave them to history and to myth, where they will remain long after we are gone. And as the fire burns low and the shadows deepen and the night grows quiet around us, perhaps we can close our eyes and be grateful. Grateful that we do not wear the crown. Grateful that we do not wear the crown, that we do not bear the weight, that we are not kings in a Greek myth, trapped in stories written long before we were born. We are simply ourselves, mortal, flawed, and free. And in the morning, when we wake, the crown will still be there, waiting in the myths, heavy with gold and blood and sorrow, but it will not be ours to wear. And for that, we can rest easy. Good night.